Now, from CBS 4 News, this is Facing South Florida with Jim Defede.
Good morning, I'm Jim Defede, and welcome to this special edition of Facing South Florida. As cruise lines try to recover from the pandemic, a few are requiring proof of vaccination. They argue they are doing this because they care about the health of their passengers and crew. Certainly a noble reason. Nevertheless, this morning we are going to take a closer look at the health care provided aboard cruise ships.
I feel as though these cruise companies literally anticipate perhaps killing people due to the negligence of their agents, that being their medical staff, and they just budget for it.
That is Laura Goodlow, and this is her with her father, Richard Puchalski.
He was quite the character. He was wild in his youth. He's the only person I know who was able to pull a permit from Chicago and host his own parade down a couple streets one Saturday afternoon. He loved to have parties. He loved food. He loved being around family and friends.
Goodlow, her brother Cliff, and the rest of their family decided to take a cruise to Alaska in 2016 to celebrate Richard's 70th birthday. However, after boarding Royal Caribbean's Explorer of the Seas, Richard felt ill and made several trips to the infirmary.
And that morning he had gotten up and still wasn't feeling great. Went down to the infirmary again, and that's kind of when all the dominoes started to fall.
The ship's doctor was a South African anesthesiologist who correctly diagnosed him as having congestive heart failure, but gave him the wrong medication. And even though they were in port in Juneau, Alaska, and could have had him properly cared for at a local hospital, she sent him back to his cabin, where he collapsed an hour later.
My brother had called my husband in a panic, indicating that he was in the stateroom and my father had collapsed. And so my husband and I obviously ran as fast as we could down to the stateroom. When we got there, we saw my father lying on the ground. The Dr. Saunders was trying to resuscitate him. And I just remember thinking to myself and saying out loud, we're losing him, because they had a defibrillator machine next to him, and it kept reading off the amount of time that had gone on since he last took a breath. And so it was 5 minutes, and then 7 minutes, and then 10 minutes, and it's all the way up to 15 minutes, and they still don't have a pulse. And not surprisingly, when they finally did inject him with an epinephrine, which is an adrenaline inducer, they were able to regain a heartbeat. But at that point in time, it had probably been over 20 minutes since he had dropped.
Cliff, you were in the room when he fell. Tell me what happened.
He gets up and says, I have to use the bathroom. And so he walks across the room, and the door barely closed, and I heard the thud on the wall, a second later.
He was eventually taken to a hospital in Juneau before being airlifted to Anchorage. As you can imagine, the family wanted to get off the ship to be with their father at the hospital, but the cruise lines blocked them.
They were, I think, trying to follow up with us to finalize our bills while we were getting off the boat. And then maybe...
Wait a second. As you were getting off the boat to go to the hospital where your father was being treated, they were talking to you about your bill?
Yeah, we had to check out and pay all of our bills before we could leave the ship. And so while my dad is, sitting in a hospital as a vegetable, essentially, we're having to pay Royal Caribbean out for, our beverage packages and internet packages, and make sure that they get made whole here. And so that obviously left a bad taste in our mouths. Nobody from Royal Caribbean followed up with us whatsoever.
The bill, however, was the least of their worries.
After about 2 days, there were doctors and cardiac people and neurosurgeons, and he didn't have oxygen for so long. He was essentially a vegetable. So my sister and my mom and I had to sit down and kind of make a decision. My dad was always kind of straightforward with what he expected out of life and how he wanted things. And, if he wouldn't have wanted to live life at 75% of what it was. And this was obviously much less than 75%. Basically, he was alive, but not living, if you understand what I mean. So we all agreed at that time that, it was best to let him die peacefully and move on.
And so sadly, we essentially watched our father die twice.
Laura, your father was 70. He has a heart attack. He dies. Why the focus on the care that he received on the boat? Why not just accept that this was the path that this was going to take?
I think that we all felt something in our gut that just wasn't adding up right from the beginning. We wanted to seek the truth. And if the truth was that my dad just simply had a heart attack and died, so be it.
And we were sitting there in Juneau, Alaska, the capital of Alaska, with numerous hospitals in town. We were there for the day. I think the message should have been, Mr. Puchalski, you should go have a real professional look you over and make sure, everything's fine, instead of just, prescribing some medication that ultimately, failed. And I think our family's message is, I don't want this to happen to anybody else. It's awful.
I'm hopeful that in pursuing this from a legal standpoint and succeeding, that number one, we can promulgate change with respect to the way these floating cities are operating in terms of their medical staffing and their facilities. There's expert testimony that said if you just kept my father seated, comfortable resting, and got him off, he would be alive and well today. And so, as my brother had stated, we don't want this to happen to anybody else. It's not to say people shouldn't go on cruises, but there really needs to be some fundamental changes made by these corporate Goliaths with respect to the investment or lack thereof into their medical staff and facilities.
The Puchalskis filed a lawsuit against Royal Caribbean in Miami federal court, and in 2019, the family was awarded $3.4 million. Todd Michaels was one of their attorneys.
So what we found in our cases is they hired doctors from all over the world with minimal experience, with experience that certainly isn't sufficient to be the sole or one of two doctors on a ship with 5,000 passengers. Every doctor that we have had in one of these cases has not even been certified to practice in the United States. So if a passenger suffered an injury while getting on the ship, the doctor wouldn't be able to treat them. But the second that ship leaves, these 5,000 people on there have nowhere else to turn.
Well, is that what it comes down to, you think, cost? That, in other words, the reason for hiring non-U.S. medical personnel is because it's cheaper to hire doctors and those who are not U.S. trained, not U.S. certified or licensed, that it's easier, cheaper to hire foreign nationals to provide that care?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at our medical system, obviously doctors are people that we hold in high esteem. They go through a lot of training. They have expertise. They're pretty well compensated, even though it sounds, at first blush like, oh, that might be interesting being a doctor on a cruise ship. You think about what it is. You're on these contracts for months. You're away from your family. They get paid a relatively low wage compared to what they'd make if they were practicing in the United States. So it's almost as if they hire the doctors that can't find suitable work anywhere else.
Do you think most people who get on a cruise ship think that the medical care that they'll receive is probably being provided by U.S. trained, licensed physicians?
That's what I was under the presumption of when I boarded that ship. And, sadly to find out that the medical staff is not licensed to practice medicine in the United States is certainly disconcerting. At one point in the trial, the defense counsel were essentially admonishing us for not investigating their own medical facilities before we got on the ship, as if to say they know and are aware that they're ill-equipped to treat individuals according to the standard of care. And it's on the passenger to research how poor of infirmaries they have on their boats. And it's our fault that we went on a cruise ship that they're providing subpar medical services on.
We asked Royal Caribbean to provide someone to discuss not only the Puchalski case, but also the broader issue of the medical care on board their ships. They refused and instead sent us this statement. Mr. Puchalski's passing was a tragic event, and our thoughts remain with the family. We are disappointed with the outcome of the lawsuit, and we stand behind our licensed and credentialed medical teams who adhere to the highest standards of care and are committed to the well-being of our guests and crew. Notice their statement doesn't say where their medical teams are licensed or what credentials they supposedly have. You'll hear more about that later. When we come back, we look at another case, this one involving Carnival.
And I kept saying to the doctor, please examine him, please look at him. He's really ill, he's really sick. You know, I just couldn't imagine the doctor not taking the time to examine Ron well.
More when we return.